thanks so much to everyone for coming. I'm Victoria Hughes from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I lead on our work in York and the North East. We've got 2 sessions today on wealth. The first session is going to focus on community wealth building, and the second is going to focus on why we need to talk about wealth. Why we need to talk about wealth will include you guys, because we want to hear from you all around your views on wealth as well. So it's going to be quite a participatory session that we're going to run. Before we get going, I just want to give a few little waves in the room. So to introduce Kate McLavin, who is going to co-chair this session with me. And also just to say we've got our Chief Exec, Paul Kissick, if you want to get a little wave, Paul, and a Director of Emerging Futures, Fire Parker, is here as well. So we'll have a break after this. If people want to have a chat with any of us, please grab us. So we're going to talk about community wealth building, and I'm going to start by talking about wealth more generally. And I thought I would take the be a bit cheeky and, as chair, talk about why I think we should talk about wealth. And I'm not going to suddenly reveal that I'm a multimillionaire or anything, but reflecting on my views on wealth and why I care about wealth. So I care about poverty. I care about injustice. And I studied social policy and politics as a degree, and then for my sins maybe moved into the civil service and worked in lots of different government departments. And it strikes me, looking back at those years, the social problems we talked about were always around poverty. They were always about low-income people. And actually, we didn't really ever talk about wealth as a social problem. And by wealth, I don't mean wealth like middle earners, I mean extreme wealth. So when we talk about, beneficiaries of state welfare, it was people on universal credit. It wasn't people that I saw through tax policy who actually got quite big tax breaks. So the narratives around wealth and poverty feel very important to me from a personal perspective. And there's a brilliant writer at UCL, Sarah Kerr, who says, maybe we should think about wealthity as well as poverty. So today we're going to think about the framing of some of these problems as we go through the session. So why does JRF care about poverty? Well, we think that if you care about, why do we care about wealth, sorry? If you care about poverty, you've got to care about wealth. So extreme poverty and extreme wealth are manifestations of the same economic extractive system that we have, which isn't good for people or planet, the vast majority of people. There are some people who are sort of riding high through the current economic system. So in the pandemic, in the first 2 years, we saw the top 10 richest men in the world, their wealth doubled. 99% of the rest of the global population saw their wealth and income fall. So we see the connection between these things. We only have to look at oil and gas companies and the huge soaring profits through assets that they've owned. And then we see the knock-on effect of energy bills for people like you and I in the room, and huge price hikes with fuel poverty, which has implicated cost of living crisis. So as an organisation, JRF cares about poverty. We have to care about wealth. Not just how it's redistributed after the event, but how it is generated, how it is accumulated, and how it is then redistributed. The other reason, of course, we have to care about extreme wealth is because of the planet. So I read something the other day by Kate Rayworth, who some of you may know, who's written about donut economics. And she said the current economic system requires 1.6 planets to sustain it. So unless, we're going to go and find a new planet to live on, which maybe some billionaires might want us to do, we've got to change our economic system, and we've got to do it quickly and urgently. And people around the world and around the UK are looking at different alternatives to our current economic system. And one alternative approach is community wealth building, which we're going to talk about today. And I think just to say, the current economic system that we have is so sort of enshrined in the way we've always lived, it's quite hard to think that things can be so different. But I love this quote by Adrienne Marie Brown. And she says, "We live and die inside of systems that were imagined centuries ago by those ambitious and narrow minds of colonists and patriarchs. We live inside the lineage of relatively ignorant imaginations which were obsessed with protection and domination, but we know so much more now. And so we're interested in, Joseph, how we imagine different alternative economic systems, how we redesign them, how we support those who are on with that work. And that's why we're going to talk about community wealth building today as an economic approach. It's not something new. It's not some abstract theory. Community wealth building, as we'll hear about in a moment, has been in place for quite a while in different countries around the world. And in the UK, it's amazing we've got Matthew Brown from Preston, and I'm sure we'll talk about the Preston model today, amongst other examples. The other thing, just to briefly says, JRF have been supporting community wealth building in York. I was just looking for a report. Can I just grab your report? Thank you. We have a report that's around the room that please take a copy of this. We had a day, thank you, earlier in the year where we brought people together from across York and across the UK to look at what would it mean to build community wealth building in York. That for me was the start of the conversation. We want to carry on that conversation today and look at some opportunities with people here today, say how can we really fuel community wealth building in York and really get this going. So please take a copy. There's a QR code on it. You can sign up for future events on that. And a big thank you to Dr. Owen Powell from St John's Uni who worked with us on that piece. So I'm going to pause there, and what we're going to do, we're going to have some speakers who are going to speak for 5 to 7-ish minutes each. We are going to start with Martin and then Frances, and then we've got speakers from York that we're going to hear from as well. We're then going to bring, is it 10 minutes? Kate's giving me a 10-minute sign. Don't scrap your talks, you can go on for 10. Then we're going to have a participatory session where we're going to kind of come into the audience and have an open discussion. So I will introduce Martin, and it's great that you're here, Martin. So Martin O'Neill is Professor of Political Philosophy here at the University of York. He's a trustee of the Democracy Collaborative, a think and do tank based in Washington, DC, which looks at different models of democratic economic organising. Among his other books and publications, Martin is the co-author with Joe Guinan of The Case for Community Wealth Building. Small plug, which is at the back of the room. If anyone wants to buy it, I've just read it and it's a brilliant read. So over to you, Martin, to tell us a bit more about community wealth building.
I'll stand up, I think. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much to Victoria, and thanks to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I've lived for 15 years now in York, and I've never been in this magnificent public space here, which I didn't even know existed. So it's lovely that my first visit is one where we're gathered here to think about these ideas. So what I want to do really is just to introduce the idea of community wealth building. Now, I feel like I'm taking coals to Newcastle here to some degree, because I'm sure there are people in the room that know all about this kind of approach to local economic policy. And Matthew Brown of Preston Council is in the room, so the pressure is on here. So Britain's leading exponent of community wealth building in practice is just here, and I'm sure we'll be able to hear from Matthew later. But what I want to do is just really lay out very quickly really the argument of the book. So you don't have to buy it. Or if you do want to buy it, it can just be a memento of the sort of main points that I want to make here. So in our book, The Case for Community Wealth Building, Joe Guinan, my co-author who runs the Democracy Collaborative in the US, so the organization that really kind of started this approach, described community wealth building as a local economic development strategy focused on building collaborative, inclusive, sustainable, and democratically controlled local economies. So it's a strategy for local economies that says if you're a local authority, or if you're a local institution like a university or a foundation like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, if you're a public or quasi-public body that lives in a particular place that has a long-run commitment to a particular community and to a particular location, how do you think about how you behave in that location? Can you take a long-run strategic interest in the development of that local economy and the development of that broader society, where you foreground values of, most importantly, democracy and equality? Can you see yourself in all of the interactions you have, all of the economic interactions you have in that area? Can you see that as your responsibility to think about the long-run promotion of democracy and equality within a local economy? So it's an approach that sees a central role for local government and for other anchor institutions like the University of York, like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, in shaping the local economy over time, not just as a provider of a set of services, taking a simple value for money approach, but instead trying to think strategically. I think the most important point, so I'll put this right at the front that I can make, is if we really want large-scale economic change, if we want to live in more egalitarian, more democratic societies, we're going to be sorely disappointed if we wait for the political parties in Westminster to drive that forward. That is not going to be news to most of you. What we have to do is see where we are, what kind of institutions are we involved with? What are our levers in terms of local government, in terms of our membership in different kinds of local institutions, and think about what changes can we make here and now, wherever we are, that can build a bridge towards a different kind of economic system. We can be optimistic maybe in the longer run for what can happen at a larger scale, but we have to really think about how we can move things along in our own areas through whatever institutional means we have. So community wealth building can involve a variety of different kinds of means and mechanisms. So the goals can be shared across different times and places, but the specific institutions and policies that can be used will be different in different places, depending on local circumstances and the ideas that emerge in each place. So community wealth building in Islington or in York or in Preston or in Ayrshire might look different depending on what mix of local institutions have you got, what opportunities do you have in a particular place. But the kinds of institutional possibilities there might involve things like the development of worker cooperatives, community land trusts, community development financial institutions, anchor procurement strategies, so thinking about how universities or local authorities spend their money, if they're buying goods and services, what kinds of firms are they doing business with? Are they trying to promote the development of cooperatives or social enterprises in their local area? It can involve municipal and local public enterprise and public and community banking. This is a messy idea, right? It's about an aim of having a more democratic and a more equal local economy, and thinking about all the different kinds of mechanisms that you can use to get there. It's not about, so if you think about ideas like basic income, the one big idea that will solve everything. This is not one big idea that will solve everything. This is about having a plurality of trying every lever you can with all the institutions that a community has under its control to shift the structure of that local economy. So I'm going to talk this is ridiculous. I'm talking about the Preston model in front of the progenitor, the parents of the Preston model. But there's Matthew. You can see him in real life there, or wearing a hat on the slide. He's taken his hat off to come inside because he's a very well brought up young man. But this is a document that Matthew, I take it, generated, or these were some of the points from his description of what they're doing in Preston, with the idea of four ideas that were at the centre of what they do. First of all, to start with the wealth that was there within the community, looking to harness the power of money that anchor institutions, that locally embedded institutions were already spending procuring goods and services. Right? It's not about finding external pots of funding. It's not about bringing in external investment. It's looking at what's already going on in your community, and can you shift the way that you do that? Can you shift the use of the wealth that's already there in a way that's more beneficial for the broader community. It's about aiming to localise as much of that spend as possible, securing investment in local supply chains and improving local economic competitiveness. Secondly, there was an element in Matthew's work about workforce, maximising the benefits of investment in staff by building a skilled and committed workforce, having a living wage, and looking to use the procurement power of the local council to spend local, to encourage their employees as well to spend local and to save local, and to develop institutions like local credit unions. It's also about thinking about land, property and investments, using anchor institution assets to lever in additional investment, to encourage the development of new businesses and to support new methods of financial intermediation. To think about where that would be relevant and useful, to think about asset transfers to the community so that particular community resources can be protected from the vagaries of local authority funding and can be community assets with a long run time horizon. And perhaps most importantly, in a way overarching this, there's a central idea of economic democracy, looking to support the growth of alternative models of economic governance, which give citizens greater investment in and control over their economic future. That could mean, very importantly, and something they've done very successfully in Preston, the development of new cooperatives, as well as other ways of helping people to feel ownership of assets and decision-making processes. I'm at that stage in life where my eyesight's got worse, so that was actually quite an achievement to get the details off the screen there. So, good. Bigger writing. I'm safe now. So, we know about the Preston model. But thankfully, this wasn't a one-off. This was an exemplar of the kind of thing that can be done in different times and at different places and in different locations. So there's been varieties of community wealth building tried in lots of different places. In the Wirral, in Kirklees, in North Ayrshire, in Scotland. You've seen in London, under very different circumstances, very successful community wealth building efforts being developed in Islington, in Hackney, in Newham. The north of Tyne and the Liverpool City region at the regional level have tried to bring this approach into what they were doing. Jamie Driscoll really pushed that forward, and I think it's very sad to see what happened there with his deselection. But also at the level of the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government, there's been a lot of interest in these ideas. So Matthew, in a way, lit a fire that has kind of had a much broader effect in terms of what can be done in other places. York isn't yet really on that list, but I am incredibly optimistic that with the recent change in leadership at City of York Council, with the enthusiastic support of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and of the University of York, that there's an awful lot of scope there to move that along. Kate is about to put up a sign saying 1 minute, so I will very quickly so maybe you do have to buy the book because this will be done too quickly. So I'm a philosopher, right? I'm not really a very practical person. So what I did is I tried to think about political ideas. So what's the core values case for community wealth building? The core values case says, look, equality is incredibly important, so is democracy, but these aren't unrelated normative ideals. They feed into each other. A more democratic society is one that's more able to realise its values. If you find more points of democratic influence and contestation within the economy, if you have a more democratised economy, then a community can do more to realise its values through different institutions. So democracy allows you to make equality more of a reality, and a more egalitarian society, a society with higher levels of social trust, with more of a sense that we're all involved in some common endeavour, that we're not just there in some horrible dystopian battle against one another, but where we can actually stand as equals. That's a society where democracy can get a real footing and move forward. So those values of equality and democracy have got an interrelation. They're mutually supportive. And fundamentally, what this different kind of economic approach is about is trying to create a social transformation to a more egalitarian and more democratic society. So, our challenge here in York is, can we do more of this here? Although I'm a philosopher, this isn't that abstract. It's being done all over the place in different parts of the world. There is proof of concept out there. All we have to do is have the enthusiasm from the relevant institutions and from the people involved with them and from the citizens of the city to try and push this sort of agenda forward. And hopefully we'll hear a lot more now today about how that might be something that can be realised in practice. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Martin. I think we're all signed up. And let's get us on that list that you talked about earlier. I'm going to hand over to Frances now, and Frances is going to talk a bit more about community wealth building and maybe a bit about sort of civic infrastructure that's required around community wealth building. Just to mention, in your examples, Martin, you talked about different councils across the country. We were meant to have Kaya Comer-Schwartz from Islington Council. This pesky thing called an election has scuppered that, but she said that she's very happy to come back for a future event, which would be great. So very pleased that we've got Frances here. So just to introduce Frances briefly, Frances Northrop is Head of Community Economic Power at the New Economics Foundation, a Director of Totnes Community Development Society, and a co-director of Abundance, and many, many other things. But over to you, Frances.
Thanks, Victoria, and thank you, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I'm actually a Bradford lass, so I love being back in Yorkshire, but I live in Devon, and I just want to talk through two stories to kind of set the scene for what grassroots community wealth building looks like and what it kind of means to me. And they're two things that I've been involved in over the last 17 years. So the story kind of starts in 2007. So kind of before the Cameron and Osborne government. And so the period of these stories has been austerity, the asset stripping of our local institutions, of all the buildings that we need and care about, at a time when arguably we should have been building more civic infrastructure because of the climate crisis, because people will need safe shores and need to be looked after here, and also because we should have been retrofitting houses and investing, but instead we've had our kind of assets stripped from us. And so the projects that I'm involved in and the ones that I advise on quite a lot are people trying to sort of reinstate that from the bottom up. So the first story is the Atmos project in Devon. It's an old milk processing plant down by the station. It employed 170 people in the town, and it was like the last big employer when it closed in 2007. The Totnes Times, our local paper, said, how much more can the town take? Everywhere, the sort of local businesses were closing down. There was a bacon factory, a normal rural sort of town, and also a timber yard that employed a lot of people. And then local people started saying, well, we've got this big space. It's already, kind of got these buildings on it. Why can't we do something on it ourselves? Why can't we open the buildings for the young people and other enterprises that people might want to start? So it's kind of like an early conversation about local economies and how you localise sort of supply chains and start things when big employers aren't coming anymore. This is a Brunel building. So Dairy Crest, who owned the site, started to rip the roof off this building because they were obviously just going to demolish it and then sell the site to the highest bidder. But they hadn't bargained for a very, very tenacious mayor who got Britain's Heritage involved and then got the building listed. And then a local group of people formed an organisation called what they call the Sustainable Business Park Group. And what they were saying was, well, it employed people, so it wants to employ people again, but what if it were jobs and businesses that were locally owned and were around environmental sustainability and care and things that people, have got talents for. And they met with the MP as was. And then it all went quiet. And Dairy Crest couldn't sell the site because it's very constrained. It's in a beautiful place by the river and the railway, but it's constrained. It's an old brownfield site, very hard to do the rejuvenation of it, regeneration. So we, for 5 years, it just sat there and they wouldn't talk to the community about it and they were happy to land bank it. So we started the Atmos Voices campaign and we talked to people in the town. We said, what could it be? It could be the heart of a new economy. What could happen? We got patrons. Jonathan Dimbleby lived nearby, so he became a patron as was our neighbour dressed as Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And we got Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. In the background, you can see that Dairy Crest were ordered to re-roof the building with Welsh slate. So some Welshmen came and put a £750,000 new roof on that, which was very gratifying. Anyway, the result of the campaign was that we with our MP then, Sarah Wollaston, who was great, got Dairy Crest to the table. They brought their external affairs guy, and when they bring their external affairs, you know that you're getting somewhere. They said, okay, we'll deal with you. We can't find a buyer for the site. What about we form a joint venture with you and you master plan it? So we formed a community development society, which is a cooperative model. We opened the site up and made an announcement with Dairy Crest. There's the town crier. People hadn't been on this site at this point for 7 years. It had just fallen more and more and more into dereliction. Somebody made a massive cake. And there we are on the site with the cake celebrating. So what we did was we did an engagement over 2 years, and I'm going to skip through this very quickly. So we invited people to come in. What could it feel like to them? People shared their memories about the site. People came and brought things in, brought photographs. That was a living room that kind of curated itself over the course of 8 weeks. People bringing photographs in. People talked about their experience of the site, what could happen here. We filmed a sped up version of walking around the site so people could see what it looked like now. There's some people, we had a futures room where people came and talked about what it could be. There's Ruby and Jemima and my daughter Alexa, who's considerably bigger and even angrier than she was then now. We went outside to the co-op, talked to people externally. We formed a community design team, brought people together, and they basically analysed all of the information that had been curated over that 6 to 8 weeks of people locally. And then we worked with a design team because we needed to unlock the site with professional people. We convened them. We were the facilitators, the developers, if you like. There they are, Liz repping for the women. Well done, Liz. So many men. But that's another story. So then over the time, we sort of showed people what the constraints of the site were, what they wanted, what they could have versus the constraints, and it kind of evolved. And over an 18-month period, we got to a master plan that people were happy with. They understood why we were at that master plan. And then we took it through what's known as a community right to build order, which meant that instead of it going to planning committee at the local council, we went to a referendum of people in the town who voted yes. It was just after the EU referendum, so we didn't campaign on a yes or no vote. We said, it's your choice, but this is what it is. And we got a yes vote. So we had a valuation done, we agreed a price with Dairy Crest, and they then rebranded as Saputo. They were bought out by Saputo in Canada. We signed the legal agreement to buy the site. We got a lottery grant for £2.75 million to restore the Brunel building even more, and then they sold it to somebody else. Now that is a whole other story that I'd need more than 10 minutes for. But we are still campaigning to get the site back, and there's all kinds of things going on. But I wanted to tell that story because it's really important that organisations and institutions that are doing community wealth building see that there is power and knowledge in communities, and that we can be the facilitators and bring together the people that are necessary, including the people who will pay for developments, to enable them to happen. So we're more than a residents who might get involved in something or just take on a building that the council doesn't need anymore. And this is something that's really, really important to me. Very briefly, Save Latin Village was something that I got involved in because of my experience with Atmos, which is a market inside an old department store in London. And that's what it used to look like. It's very beautiful. Then it wasn't very beautiful for quite a while. TfL, Transport for London, bought it. They let it sit derelict, and then somebody came along and said, well, we could open a market in the shell. It became a Latin American market based on the Latin sort of a Latin village, which is why it's called the Latin Village. This is what happened inside. They transformed it into this beautiful, beautiful space where there were shops, and then it was open in the evening. People would watch football, people would play music, people would dance. And then the local council previously had said to a developer called Granger, oh, we want a nice clean redevelopment down that end of Haringey. Please can you bring us a Pasta Express and a Costa, whatever. So the people who were the traders said, no, that's not what we want. And a very early stage kind of idea of community wealth building, fought a campaign from 2007, won for Granger, won the campaign, Granger backed off, and Transport for London are now working with them to develop that as a community-owned market with Transport for London as the landlord. So the reason I'm telling these stories very quickly is because the developer model is this. It's very, very functional and very much what Victoria was saying about the old model of the ways of doing things. We put loads of public subsidy into private development and they walk away. They often do not a very good development. Sometimes it looks better, but it's not great, and then they take the profit. This is what happens when you work with the community to do development. And it doesn't mean that the community has to do everything. It just means that the community are the conveners, and because they're the people who know best and can work in partnership. So we talk in terms of, instead of private finance initiatives, public commons partnerships, where you look to the community, you stand alongside your community, very much like community wealth building, and you say, you need a social license to operate here if you are a developer and you want to take profit. So just a nod to a few other projects that are good to look up, but I've not been involved in, so I don't know the story so well. East Marsh United, they buy old houses on their estate, they do them up, they rent them out, and they employ people locally to do them up. Sadaka, the Sheffield and District African Caribbean Association, been in that building since the early 70s, and they look after it. They've got a bar and a function centre in there. They see over like 200 young people go through every week, older people with a lunch club. This is Wolves Lane in Haringey as well, where the local communities, the Ballet Initiative and Organic Lee have taken that over. It used to be a council-run allotment, so that's another one to look up. And then finally, this is in Bradford, where a local community have come together and created this is, a growing space at the end of their rows of terraced houses. So yeah, so that's just the kind of the scene that I wanted to set. I'm a really big supporter of community wealth building inside institutions, but there has to be some way of nurturing kind of what's coming up from the grassroots as well, so that you get the maximum benefit. Thank you. Oh, excuse me.
Thanks so much, Frances. So much inspiration to get us fired up for what we can do in York and learn from some of those examples that Frances talked about. We're going to move now on to our next speaker, Natasha Almond. And Natasha runs the Good Organisation. She's the director of Good Organisation in York, which helps marginalised people benefit from York's tourism. She's currently researching community-led tourism with the Institute for Social Justice at York St John, and Tash holds creative conversations in communities that are an inspiring blueprint for transitional accommodation and shared narratives for sustainable cities, which Tash will tell us all about. Thanks, Tash.
Thank you. So, hello, I'm just going to move away from that incredibly bright light. So yeah, you heard who I am, Natasha, and involved in the Good Organisation in York. And since we started in sort of 2018, our mission has been to look at the money that is brought in through tourism, millions and millions of pounds, and see how we can support that wealth to benefit our citizens. Especially those that are most socially or financially disadvantaged. So we've run a number of projects that I'm hoping to tell you a little bit about, so you can understand how we are looking at community wealth building. So one of the projects that we run is called Invisible Cities Tours. So we work with people that have been affected by homelessness, addiction, or the experience of the criminal justice system, and they've got an interest in history, this group, so they've come together and they've developed their tours, and they incorporate some of their own narrative within these tours, so please do look out for them. And you can see Vicky, she's got lots of 5-star ratings, and it's a very good tour. And we've also done a number of GPS apps. So these are tours that you can, digital tours. And again, has two things. So one, it brings in a passive income for us to develop community projects, but it also provides opportunities for people that were living in hostels through lockdown to have a meaningful activity. And through that, we created a tour in the heritage of history and poverty, or philanthropy actually, within the city. And we've also done one on LGBT plus history and inspiring women. We've done numerous workshops, and this has included designing, working with people to design heritage-based T-shirts and posters. And we're currently involved with the Civic, York Civic Trust, with one of the ginormous sculptures of the tansy beetle, where we're going to sort of highlight the sort of plight of the Luddites. So if anyone wants to find out more, that will be launching in August. And we're also just about to start, well, it's already started, but we're working towards a pop-up museum that will look again at the history of homelessness, historical perspectives on homelessness, and we're working with people that have all experienced homelessness. One of the projects I really loved was Postcards from the Edge. So this is where we gave people that experienced homelessness cameras, and they went to the edges of our city to look at taking photos of heritage. And then we did Postcards for the Pandemic, where people went out into the city and took postcards of beautifully empty streets because there was not one tourist around. And then oh no, I shouldn't have gone on to that, just click back. But there's a number of other things that we've done. So we've also collaborated with some colleagues, one's in the room here, on ideas on books. So we've created a number of interactive books, and one called Homeless Bound, because as we've been working within tourism and looking at this sort of community wealth, we've learned a lot more about the pressures that people have faced that have been experienced homelessness. And so we wrote a book to look at those public misconceptions of homelessness. And then back from that, back onto our tourism thing, we're just about to launch a book on another interactive book. So there'll be lots of digital content on hidden tracks, which is about York's Snickleways. So it just gives you an example of some of the work that we do. And all of that money comes back in to look at us going back out to deliver sort of community-based projects. Over the last 4 years, we have employed 15 people. And so you can see some of the impacts that we've had. But as you can imagine, through this work and working alongside people, we've sort of really understood the impact that tourism can have on our residents and our communities. And so this led us to go and do much more community conversations that Victoria alluded to look at sustainable cities and look at some of those issues around the housing crisis. And this led us to do some further investigation, and we discovered that 242 of our inner city properties are owned by offshore accounts. And this obviously has a massive impact on our residents and our communities and some of the problem solving. So for years, people have been talking about taking over above shops and looking at affordable accommodation. Well, if we can't have those conversations with those landlords, that makes those solutions quite hard. Then we created a fanzine. So we brought together all of that data from our various community conversations and our investigations and put them into a fanzine, and hopefully you've all got one on your seat. This also includes a shared narrative. So all of those people that came to our community conversations, in the central bit is our shared narrative about how we would work together to make a more community wealth building city of York. So where do we want to go now? At the moment, I'm working with this Institute of Social Justice looking at community wealth building through tourism. And that research, which will come out in an academic paper and a documentary later in July, which you're all welcome to attend. If you want to come, please talk to myself or Kenny and we'll take your email address. I'm just going to read a couple of things from this that are voices that have come out from our residents. So first of all, you can see that your ethnic communities desire recognition in the city for the tourism offer, which resonates with them and their visiting families, and that we can have a more diverse attraction. That the rise of Airbnb is less, some areas have very few residents, causing local businesses to reconsider whether they're even going to operate in York due to the perceived talent vacuum. People want to introduce a tax levy. I know there's been lots of conversation about this recently, but in this case, ring-fenced to address tourism impacts, allowing the residents themselves to influence its allocation. And then two more points which are pertinent to the conversation we're going to have in a minute is the reduced access to public spaces that we've been talking about today. That reduced access to public spaces means there's been a decrease in diversity of our nighttime economy. Residents want to host a range of arts and cultural events, believing this will both enrich us as citizens and the tourists alike. But where people are struggling is that it's very hard with our few music community venues left for people to bring in a talent into the city because the hotel prices are so expensive. If you're having to pay £200 a head and you have a band of 10 people. So where do we want to go next? So we want to reclaim York for its residents while still welcoming the tourists. And we want to explore equitable tourist tax levies and challenge some of those legislative changes. We want to continue to promote fair Airbnb and also offer the opportunity for residents to feed into York's tourism strategy, because we will be hopefully hosting a residents' voice that will feed directly into that. So today, we would like you to consider the viability of developing a community-owned hotel. You've heard those voices about how hard it is to bring artists into the city. So could we consider how the arts and cultural community could come together to look at a community-owned hotel? Cheers. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Tash. And we'll come on in a moment to think about this as a room, how we take some of these ideas forward. Before then, I'm going to introduce our final speakers. We've got Ben Porter and we've got Helen Jones from. It's interesting how you describe this. So we're part of a York crew. What that means is we've worked together for the past year on some work that JRF funded with an organisation called New Constellations, an amazing organisation that does place-based work, which is about imagining how we move to different futures, to fairer futures. So last summer, we put a call out to people in York who wanted to come together to act in service of how we create a fairer future for York. And I'm really pleased that Ben and Helen kind of responded to that call. And together we've been working together for the past year, meeting monthly to discuss, how can we work together in service of the future of York. Ben and Helen are going to talk about an idea that we've been developing together. I'll just kind of introduce Ben and Helen individually. So Ben is the founder of York Creatives Network in York and runs a shared workspace in the centre of York called A Collective. There is a list of like 500 other things that Ben does that I won't name. Helen Jones is chair of York Disability Rights Forum and co-founder of York Quiet Pride, a pride event that celebrates disability. So over to you guys.
Okay. First of all, we'd thank you very much for introducing us. We would like to thank New Constellations for guiding our journey. They help people to imagine and create better, more beautiful futures by holding experiential spaces, leading reflection and leading expansive practices. But now on to our story. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, or about 11 months ago at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation homestead lawn, I met Ben. We gathered with 18 or so other York folk in tents. We were fortified against the wind by hot water bottles and blankets. And over the course of 4 days, we journeyed together, taking a ship over future seas and leaving behind the York we thought we knew. We time travelled and we brought back tales of a York where people swim in the ooze, where radical accessibility is the norm, and where food is grown on the city walls, not daffodils. We returned with hope and ideas, inspirations and examples of new ways of doing things. And since those days in the tents, we've met once a month or so in a way that throws corporate norms completely overboard. One of our outcomes so far has been a self-crew and city framework, which can be seen at the table that's sort of just next to the books at the back. The framework is a new metric for measuring impact, and it takes into account inner transformation, group transformation, and transformation of the wider system. The self-crew and city framework will accompany the stars that we have to guide our journey ahead of us in exploring alternative governance and alternative ways of working. And I'm going to hand over to Ben now.
Thanks, Helen. So, as Helen mentioned, we spent 4 days together as a crew, working through a series of exercises that got us to think about what is and what isn't working in our current system. Using the floor space in the tent where the workshop was held, we mapped out the future that we dreamed of moving York towards and what we wanted to leave behind. This gave us a set of guiding principles, or as we call them, stars, that help us navigate this long journey towards a brighter future for our city. The stars included things like rehumanising the concept of value, putting community at the heart of the economy, representing and including all members of society, and ensuring that environmental sustainability was always front of mind, never an afterthought. We then started to generate ideas for projects that we could work on which would demonstrate what could be possible in York when working guided by these stars. And we came up with ideas like opening a museum of York's future, where residents can come and see and contribute towards the plans that will shape the development of the city. Starting a futures fund for York, a fund that would invest in projects that think about not just the next generation, but the next 7 generations of citizens who will inhabit the legacy that we're leaving behind today. We thought about ways to protect river rights, ensuring that we all have access to a clean river, green spaces, and good air quality. Now, I'm sure you'd all agree that these projects sound great, but the challenge, of course, is to make these ideas sustainable in a way that allows them to run long enough to have a compound impact. And for that, we must design a system that is self-sustaining and could grow in its reach and impact over time. So we spent some time thinking about that system, and what we thought we needed to start with was a radical, accessible community space. Somewhere that gave home not just to our ideas, but to many of the other community groups that already exist in the city, but don't have an affordable and accessible place to meet. Because we can't talk about bringing radical ideas to life if we don't first have a radical space for them to be tried out in. Somewhere that we could demonstrate environmental sustainability and alternative ways of doing business. Somewhere we could bring fellow residents in and get them talking about their vision of the future of York too. And when we thought about it, what this felt like was a new version of a social club, a physical space in York where locals felt a sense of belonging in a time when a growing number of residents no longer even visit the city centre because they feel it's not for them, but for the tourists. Now, if this social club idea seems a little left field, allow me to explain how we think it could work in terms of a system. And I'm going to use the analogy of a gym. So, gym owners lease a space, which they provide to their members on a monthly subscription basis. This gives them a fairly predictable monthly recurring revenue, which allows them to run classes, provide equipment, and keep the place warm and clean. Whatever profit is left at the end after their expenses are covered goes into the pockets of the owners of the business, the shareholder. So this whole model is really built to serve one person or a very small group of people, the shareholders, which encourages them to think extractively and to reinvest as little as possible as long as the profits keep flowing to them. We were thinking, what if we took this model, but instead of offering exercise classes, we offered food, drinks, a place to engage in creative and cultural activities, somewhere you could take classes in learning sign language, Or you could learn how to start a cooperative. Or perhaps you could learn how to test the water quality in your local area. Local residents could come along and pay ad hoc for these activities, or they could sign up on a monthly basis like they would at a gym, which gives them discounts on the activities, but crucially gives the social club a predictable recurring revenue, and also a close relationship with the people using the space the most, ensuring that we programme activities they really want to see brought into that space. Then whatever profit we have at the end, after we've covered our costs, is directed into the York Futures Fund. Every member of the club then gets to vote on what this money is spent on, giving them the power to contribute towards shaping the future of the city through their membership. See, as long as we created a space that people really wanted to spend time in, that would give us an ongoing surplus to keep putting into community projects, which improves the value of the offer, leading to more people signing up, and hopefully it becomes a self-sustaining cycle that could then be scaled up over time. So how would we get it started? How much would members have to pay to kind of get this off the ground? Well, here's a radical idea. What if instead of offering tiered memberships that seek to extract the money out of those who are most in need of the services, what if instead everybody paid the same? What if everyone paid something like 0.5% of their income as a membership fee? For someone on a salary of $30,000 a year, that would be $150 a month or £150 a year or £12.50 a month. For somebody on 100k, that would be $500 a year or £42 a month. For someone on universal credit, that would be £23.60 a year or £1.96 a month. This would be a way for us to share the cost across the community, with those who can afford to pay more being able to do so, but with those who can only offer a little, still feeling like a fully valued member because they're still paying the same percentage everybody else. See, we're all used to paying subscriptions for things like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Spotify now, all things that keep us isolated in our homes staring at our screens. What if instead we took some of that money and put it into something that got us out of the house, walking around and talking to our neighbours? Wouldn't we all be happier people? So I, for one, would gladly pay 0.5% of my income to have access to a space like this that I felt really catered for residents rather than for tourists.
And I love the idea, and I think as long as it aligns with our stars, again, you can see those at the back on the table. For example, it's radically inclusive, which, given York has got a very limited number of wheelchair accessible spaces, is vital. It needs to be ecologically sustainable and governed through participatory decision making, which would allow a diverse group of people to shape the space and its future development. For me, the importance of this space is that it can nourish and nurture radical ideas and create a space for rehearsing the futures we want to see in our city. So our question from the new Constellations York Crew to you, the audience, the experts, if we didn't use the model that Ben's described, what other models could we use to make this economically sustainable?
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks so much. So, yeah, you've not come here for a free ride to kind of just sit and listen, I'm afraid. We're going to pick your brains in a second and you're going to help us come up with these answers. So I'm going to hand over to Kate, who's going to talk about the next participatory session. Thanks, Kate.
Right. Thank you, Victoria. So we wanted to tap into all the rich wisdom that we know is in this room. And as Victoria said, we're going to move into the participatory discussion session for today. And if you came here not thinking that you would be asked to do this, that's fine if you're not up for it. Please take an active role as a listener. But we're going to take 20 minutes now to consider both of the questions posed to us. And we're also going to have our speakers and some of JRF staff dotted amongst you in the room to engage in the discussion. You've also got prompt cards in front of you. So yeah, take a moment with the groups, the clusters that you're in, to start answering. Initially, Natasha's question, as a reminder, is what would it take for communities and civic infrastructures to make community hotel a reality in York? So you've got about 10 minutes to do that, and I will bring you all back in a sec. We're going to move on to the second question posed by the new Constellations crew. So that's back on the board here. If we didn't use the social club model, what would be another model we could use to make the idea of a community hub economically sustainable? So we've got another 10 minutes. Feel free to write your ideas on your prompt cards, and we'll bring people back into the front in a bit. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging in a bit of conversation. We hope that that gave you an opportunity to share some of your own thoughts about these two potential community wealth building initiatives in York. We are going to move to checking back in with our speakers, thinking about what they heard from the room and also what their final closing thoughts are. Ben, am I right to start with you?
Sure, just summarising what we've been talking about.
Yeah, what came out of your discussions in your table and what are you taking away?
So we had 3 really great suggestions in terms of improving the social club model. These were things to kind of add to rather than to replace. The first one was, if people can't afford to pay membership, can they become members through perhaps donating their time or teaching a class or things like that, to opening up to people who have skills to share. The second one was being super transparent on the leadership of the space and actually like when votes are cast so people can see the results of those votes. So to make it really obvious what people are voting for and how that has been governed. The third one as well was that in order to reach the people who you want to have in the space, it's probably not enough to just open up and say, here, subscribe to this. You have to actually go out into the communities and do lots of outreach to find the people who need the most and bring them into the space.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben, and thank you everybody who took part in that discussion to share your wisdom. Natasha, I'm going to come to you.
Right, yeah, just a couple of points. It was really good, actually. So what came from the table is, do we need a community-owned hotel to invite the musicians in, or could we have a network where we actually open up our houses to invite the musicians to stay? So that was a brilliant idea. The other thing is, if we did want to have a community-owned venue, how would we sort of persuade the powers to be that in letting us invest in that property? So we need to convince that the diversity of tourism is beneficial for the city in the long run. You know, to bring in those sort of different people into the city, and so that they should give us a building.
Brilliant.
I explained that very well.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. Frances, what are the insights that you gathered from your group, and maybe what are your personal points that you'd like to share with the local groups?
I think for me, I always sort of talk in terms of we're made to feel like things are really scarce and increasingly scarce when really there's an abundance of things. So our group talked about the definition of wealth as being more than just money. And obviously the example of people opening up their homes. So we have got that kind of way of being. So thinking with an abundant mindset. And also that there are already lots of existing community organisations doing this work. So much like you were saying. And, you know, talking to those people who are doing things already and bringing people together to think about how you create more. But I suppose my final thing is always that I love the work that I do, partly because I really love political strategy and figuring out and campaigning and figuring out how you move people to get to a place where you get what you want. And I don't know what that says about me, so I'll worry about that later, maybe get some counselling. Anyway, but what I really like that, because together we are super smart and we can totally, you know, capital is just it's a very blunt instrument. It's like, there's a building, I can make some profit off it. There's some land, there's a business, I can make some profit off it. I'm going to do it. I have no empathy, or, you know, that's the rules, and I can do that because shares say that I have to make maximum profit for my business. Whereas as people coming together, we've got a wealth of imagination in the way that we can approach things, and by doing that, that's where we'll get to the place where we've got the stuff more than the people who shouldn't have it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Frances. Martin, I'm going to pass to you.
So one thing that struck our group was a kind of bootstrapping problem, right? So here we have one issue about the need for more kind of community-run asset like a hotel. Then there's another thing, the need for like something like a community social centre. And clearly, it might be that both of those have a joint solution. It might actually be that what's needed is something that could kind of encompass both of those sorts of functions. And why isn't it initially put in those ways? Because at the moment we lack the kind of shared democratic space where people are meeting each other, bumping into each other, and where the different kinds of partial projects that different groups are doing haven't had the opportunity to all collide together, right? And then what do you need to have that space? Well, you need to solve the problem that generated the problem in the first place. It looks like what you need is that shared space, that space for kind of shared, equal democratic engagement. That's exactly what you need in order to then get you to the position where you see all these links and you see the fact that there's so many people in the community that have shared goals and aspirations and that want to kind of solve those together. So I guess one thing that came from that, in a way, there's a kind of a risk and an opportunity. The thought that it's hard to kind of overcome the initial problems here, but the thought is that once you have more of that shared democratic space, it's easier as a community to do problem solving and to actually think about solutions to the problems that we're facing. Some of the issues that came up as well, though, were about, and this echoes things that have already been said, about really thinking seriously about the wealth and the kind of opportunities that we already have, whether that's thinking about, you know, where people have spare rooms or where, and could offer that as a resource, you know, for when there are particular kinds of visitors or whatever, but also thinking about our institutions and our shared spaces that are sitting empty a lot of the time. If you think back to a great example in British political history, I think, the GLC. When the GLC took over County Hall, they basically said to kind of voluntary groups, to community groups in London, this is a people's space. Come in and use this however you can. We need more of that from the council, we need more of that from our universities, and we need more of that kind of attitude from a lot more of the institutions in our community to say, look, we've got all these beautiful buildings, we've got all this physical infrastructure, we're not making enough of it because, as Frances said, we're thinking of everything as like, oh, is there a bit of rent to be got here? What can we do at the margin? How do we balance the books? Instead of thinking that these are community assets that we have temporary stewardship over and that we ought to be deploying for our collective good. So that's one thought.
Thank you. Helen, we're going to come to you now.
Yeah, it always feels a little bit strange being the last one because all of those ideas we sort of touched on. One thing we touched on that hasn't been mentioned in terms of like the social club idea, however you call it that or not, is the location of it. And this is me talking as Helen, not as part of the York Crew right now. I would think it would need to be in community, not something that would go into the city centre. And I think maybe that didn't come across when we were talking. So for me, it would want to be embedded in a local area. And there's something within that if this is, you know, a little test project, if we can show that it works, that it has a lot of those kind of wider benefits, the concept is replicable. And if we've done the groundwork, the test work, we'll have worked out some of those issues that other people would come across. And I mean, I don't see what's to stop York from having multiple of these around the city so that you genuinely rebuild local communities.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everybody, for supporting this discussion, for helping give really granular feedback, for suggestions about hosting rock stars in your homes. I will be signing up for that. Thank you for kind of sharing these inspiring stories of worker co-ops. And I'm going to quickly hand to Victoria for closing notes, but it's been a really generative discussion.
Cool, thanks again. I'll just use this. Yeah, just a massive thank you to everyone for coming along and a huge thank you to our speakers. I'm just going to wrap up with a few very quick reflections from me. I think just the power of this conversation, and for me, how hopeful and optimistic it feels. This point that change comes from communities. You know, this isn't about waiting for someone to come over the hill to save us. You know, the power is here. I think there has been a change in the conversation nationally and locally. You know, the time is now to kind of move on this. And I think for York, you know, JRF are situated here. We've got 2 brilliant universities. We've got a number of anchor institutions. So, you know, how we work together with communities to drive this forward feels really, really critical and really exciting. You know, I'm leaving this session feeling really hopeful and buoyed up for the future of this work, and I hope that you are too. The Fairer Futures event I mentioned earlier, for me, was kind of an introduction of this conversation in the city. As I said, there's a QR code on the report. Please sign up if you'd like to hear about future events, which we will be planning. So as I mentioned, Kaya from Islington couldn't make it. I'd love to get her here. I'd love, Matthew, for you to come back and maybe have a broader conversation. So please keep an eye out for different events in the future. Just a final thought as well. Just picking up on Frances's point about abundance, really sort of resonated with me. I think we live in a time where we talk about scarcity a lot, and actually turning that on its head and thinking of abundance and what, again, is in this room and on the streets in this amazing city feels very, very powerful. So what we have is here. It's about us coming together, galvanising that support and moving it forward. I'm going to finish with a quote. I always do. This is from Rob Hopkins, who actually came along to the Festival of Ideas last year. If you don't know Rob Hopkins' books, we don't have one here, please Google him. He's amazing, talking about the future and imagination and some of these changes we can take forward. And he says, if we wait for the government, it'll be too little, too late. If we act as individuals, it'll be too little. But if we act as communities, it might just be enough, just in time. Thanks, everybody.